everyone? No? Oh, welcome. Well, welcome back for those who have been here before. My name is Motoko Hioki, and I am Public Programs Manager at this museum. And I welcome you guys to the lunchtime lecture. We do this every month, and typically Wednesday of the month. And this month, we welcome Daniel Piazza, our Chief Curator of Philately here at the National Postal Museum. In his talk today, will highlight the objects from our newest exhibition about Alexander Hamilton. And I didn't know about this, but he has been a decades-long fan of Hamilton. How did I not know? And he will discuss the ways in which Hamilton championed the post office department in its earliest form. And you can definitely catch a glimpse of the original pistol used by Hamilton and Aaron Burr in their 1804 duel after the lecture. It's in the exhibit downstairs. And I like to share a little bit about Dan. Mr. Piazza began his current position as the Chief Curator of Philately in July 2014. Mr. Piazza is responsible for exhibitions, research, and acquisitions related to the museum's 6 million postage stamps and related artifacts, which form the largest philatelic collection in the world. And second largest collection at the Smithsonian Institution. Does anyone know which Smithsonian Museum holds the largest collection?
Natural history.
Natural history is correct, yes. And he was awarded a 2016 Smithsonian Research Prize from Secretary David Squirton for his work on the exhibition and its catalog titled Freedom Just Around the Corner, Black America from Civil War to Civil Rights. Mr. Piazza is a member of numerous national and international philatelic societies and frequent contributor to philatelic journals and collector periodicals. He's also a member of the American Philatelic Society's Council on Postal Collectors and will be part of the organizing committee for the Boston 2026 World Expo, which will be the 12th International Philatelic Exhibition to be held in the United States. From 2010 to 2015, Mr. Piazza was the president of NAPEX, one of the largest and most prestigious annual philatelic exhibitions in the United States. And the list of his accomplishments goes on, but I'll stop here now. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dan Piazza.
Thank you. Whenever Motoko calls me Mr. Piazza or my wife uses my middle name, I know I'm in trouble. Either way, I know I've done something wrong. Thank you very much for coming to the lecture. I guess the Motoko was a little surprised to learn that I've been a Hamilton fan, if you want to put it that way, for a long time. Long before there was a musical, in fact. Other Hamilton fans in the room? Okay, so you're all here. Just say Alexander Hamilton and everybody turns up. Well, that's great. And so we have an exhibition on Alexander Hamilton downstairs in our rotating philatelic exhibition galleries, the Postmaster Suite in the William H. Gross Stamp Gallery. And probably the question I've gotten asked most frequently as I'm leading tours and showing people the exhibition is, well, there's all sorts of neat stuff in this exhibition, including the original dueling pistols used by Hamilton and Burr on July 11th, 1804, but why is it at the Postal Museum? I don't quite understand that part of it. So what I thought I'd do for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then follow it up with whatever types of questions you'd like to ask, is offer some thoughts on the connection between Alexander Hamilton and the postal system as it existed during his lifetime. And I'll do it all without slides, so I'll try and hold your attention for 20 minutes without slides. So if you're watching online, I guess there's no error. It's not that you're not seeing the slides. There are no slides for this particular talk. There was a phrase that was commonly used to describe intellectuals in the 17th and 18th century. And they would frequently, they were largely men, they would frequently be described as men of letters. Maybe you've heard that phrase. And in its most basic sense, to be a man of letters in the 17th or 18th century meant that you were literate, yes, But a little bit more than that, it meant that you were generally part of some sort of a organized or semi-organized long-distance community of intellectuals who corresponded with each other through the mail, through the use of letters. So the term letters was very specific to the mail. And I think Alexander Hamilton fits that sort of mold of a 17th or 18th century man of letters. But to be fair, most of the founders of the American Republic fit that mold to one degree or another. Hamilton is distinctive, I think, in a couple of ways. One is that of all the founders, Hamilton is the one whose career was launched with a letter and whose life was ended by a series of letters. And that is that as a young boy on the island of St. Croix in 1772, he witnesses a hurricane and writes to the local newspaper of the devastation wrought by the hurricane. And he writes about it in terms of pathos and with a depth of feeling that for a 17-year-old kid in the 1760s are fairly extraordinary. And this letter is published in the local newspaper, and it's one of the ways that through his writing of letters and the publication of his letters in a newspaper, that his intellectual abilities come to the notice of local influential people who then take up a collection to send him to America for a college education. And then his life is ended, sort of oddly or eerily, in a very similar manner, and that is through the publication of letters in a newspaper. So the way that the duel comes about in 1804 is that Aaron Burr who's Vice President of the United States, has just run for governor of New York in the election of 1804 and has lost, and blames his loss, blames two losses really on Alexander Hamilton. One is he ran for president in 1800 and he ran for governor of New York in 1804, and both times Alexander Hamilton had been fairly outspoken against Burr. But specifically in 1804, when he loses the election for governor of New York, he makes several indiscreet remarks about Aaron Burr and his character at a dinner party in Albany. And one of the attendees of this dinner party writes a letter to a friend describing some of the things, intemperate and indiscreet remarks that Hamilton had made about Aaron Burr. And this letter, in ways that are still not entirely known, I think, is intercepted and ends up in the publishing office of the local newspaper, the Albany Register, and it appears in print. And then there's a series of letters from his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, who's one of the most influential men in upstate New York anyway, in the early 19th century, defending him. There's, in a sense, a war of letters that plays itself out in the newspapers and leads to the ultimate challenge to a duel that leads to Hamilton's death. So in an eerie sort of way, his career is launched and his life is ended by a series of letters that are published in newspapers. I don't know what to take from that, but in terms of a man who had intimate connection to the written word, particularly in the form of letters that went through the mail, and then ultimately where many of them ended up being published, I think he was sort of distinctive in that regard.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
When he wrote to the newspaper about hurricane, what was he do? Like, what was his occupation or what was his status? And also, how did he learn how to write so well?
Well, Alexander Hamilton had been a clerk in the West Indies office of a New York merchant shipping company. And so he's largely self-educated. He had some early education, but his background and his early education were always shrouded in a certain amount of obscurity. And this is a fact that he was reminded of constantly throughout his political career, that he came from ignominious or obscure origins. And it's something that he's always defending himself against, often in writing and often in letters to political allies. But he writes the letter describing the aftermath of the hurricane in, it's almost a apocalyptic type of a style. But it was a rhetorical style that was pretty common at the time, and very attractive to people at that time. Now we would look at it and say this is a lot of sort of purple prose, kind of strange, florid phrasing and all this type of stuff. But at the time, it was what people sort of expected in public letters like that, and so he really attracted attention and the patronage of some wealthy people. And then he does the same thing after he comes to America and studies at King's College, which is now Columbia University in New York. And then when the American Revolution breaks out, he decides fairly early on to cast his lot in with the Americans and to join the American Revolution on the revolutionary side. And one of the reasons I think he's attracted to that is that he is someone with not a distinguished pedigree or inherited wealth or illustrious background. And so he understands and sees that the military service in the revolution will be key to his future career, and that he could rise rapidly and attract the attention of, again, wealthy and powerful men who would advance his career. And the first person he attracts the attention or the notice of in that way is Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene is a major general in the Army. He's the quartermaster general of the Army, so he's the person responsible for keeping the Army fed and clothed and logistics on the march and so on and so forth. And it's Greene who first approaches Alexander Hamilton and asks him to become his aide-de-camp. An aide-de-camp in the Continental Army is essentially a secretarial position. So, you've got generals who are in command and who are issuing orders and writing letters. They're not writing the letters themselves, and generally they have assistants called aides-de-camp who are writing the letters for them. They're taking down the general orders of the day and making sure that they're published to the Army in the field and so on and so forth. That's what an aide-de-camp does. So a large part of the job is in a sense, secretarial. And that's what Nathaniel Greene asks Alexander Hamilton to be for him. Hamilton turns him down. Says, but I would like an introduction to General Washington. It's an imagined conversation, but that was the gist of their relationship. And ultimately, Hamilton does come to Washington's notice and ends up becoming Washington's aide-de-camp. So many of the letters that are attributed to George Washington, signed by George Washington, and general orders issued under his authority, are actually at least drafted, at least in part, by Alexander Hamilton. And so he first makes himself useful to the great man, General Washington, again, for his ability to write letters and communicate on his behalf. And then again, when Washington is elected president and Hamilton becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury, an interesting thing takes place. So the Post Office Department had been around since at least 1775, but it had been on more or less annual appropriations since 1775. It was not a permanent part of the federal bureaucracy, so to speak, until 1792. And then when it becomes a permanent part of the bureaucracy, the decision has to be made, where does it live? What department does it report to? And President Washington decides that the Post Office Department will report to the Treasury. And the reason for this is pretty simple. There are very few mechanisms that the federal government has in the 1790s for turning a profit or raising money. One of those is the Customs Service, so import and export excises and taxes is one way that the government has to raise money, and the other is postage rates. Postage rates are seen as a revenue generator for the federal government, and generating revenue for the federal government is a particular interest of Alexander Hamilton's. And it's an interest of Hamilton's because he sees the country's paying of its Revolutionary War debts as critical to its future economic stability. So most of the debt that had been contracted by the United States during the Revolutionary War was contracted not by the federal government, but by the individual states. And in the years since the Revolution, those states had retired or paid off their debt in a somewhat haphazard, uneven fashion. Some states had paid off very little of their debt. Most states were somewhere in the middle. Some states had already paid off all of their debt by the early 1790s. And Hamilton sees this as a problem because the United States is getting a bad credit rating overseas, being known for paying back its debts in an unpredictable, haphazard sort of fashion. So Hamilton's plan for the future stability of the government is that the federal government should assume all the state debts that are remaining when he becomes Secretary of the Treasury and pay them off predictably and steadily at about 5% a year. And this causes an uproar because some states have already paid off their debt, so why should they be taxed again to pay off the debts of other states that haven't retired their debt? You see the problem that this causes. The mechanism for raising the funds to pay off those debts are going to be the customs taxes and the postage rates. So that's the reason for the decision to place the Post Office Department under Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. Of course, he's not particularly interested in the Post Office Department. He's more interested in the mint because he was a student of currency, coinage, and all these sorts of things. But the mint, interestingly enough, in the 1790s lives under the Department of State. And the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who's one of Hamilton's great political rivals, is in charge of the mint. And actually, at one point, Hamilton tries to broker a deal, a swap, between the Treasury Department and the State Department. And he goes to Jefferson and says, well, if you'll give me the mint, I'll give you the post office. So he actually, although he's in charge of the post office, he actually at one point tries to give it away to another government agency. But he's also, I think, very conscious and very sensible of the post office's possibilities and what it can do for someone like him, like the Secretary of the Treasury. And so as Secretary of the Treasury, he had what was called the free franc. And the free franc is the ability to send official mail for free just by signing your name across the front of the mail piece. And we have lots of examples of free francs on display from Benjamin Franklin in the National Stamp Salon and Alexander Hamilton in the Hamilton exhibit. We have other examples in other places. Hamilton uses that free franc to the max. And one of the ways that he uses that free franc is he writes to his collectors of customs in all of the ports up and down the eastern seaboard incessantly, constantly. Several of them remark on that it's almost another sort of part-time job to constantly reply to Hamilton's letters. And what are Hamilton's letters about? He wants to know all the details of the shipping coming in and out of the port. Where is it coming from? What are they carrying? What is the tonnage of the ship? What the construction? What flag is it flying? All of these sorts of details. He was a master at using the postal system as Secretary of the Treasury to collect all of this detailed information. And then he had a gift for being able to analyze and interpret and recall that information almost at will. So he, in many ways, Alexander Hamilton was one of the most data-driven members of Washington's cabinet, whereas others like Jefferson and Madison, Adams, more or less, I mean, they were involved in contemporary affairs, but they looked more to ancient models, Greece and Rome, for philosophies of government and how things should be run, and they were much more theoretical. Hamilton was really into the nuts and bolts of his job as Secretary of the Treasury and wanting to understand how debt worked, how raising revenue worked, how the value of currency fluctuated, and what that meant for the future economic prospects of the country. So he was very data-driven in that regard rather than being especially theoretical or philosophical. And the way he collected that data at the time was through the mail. This was how the customs collectors in all of the ports returned not only their required, sort of monthly or quarterly reports, but then also replied to all of Hamilton's, multiple inquiries in between. And it helped that many of the collectors of customs in the various ports were fellow Revolutionary War veterans who Hamilton knew from his service in the Continental Army. Many of them were members with him of something called the Society of the Cincinnati, which still exists. Its headquarters is here in Washington, D.C. They lent us one of their prized historical emblems for the exhibition. They have their own Hamilton exhibition on display right now. It's quite good in their museum, a little further up Massachusetts Avenue. So that's a little bit of a plug for them. So he pulls on the social network of the day, which is the mail system, and kind of the old Revolutionary War buddy system, to get all of this data that he needs, and then interprets it and turns it into policy. So he was, I think, a master user of the mail. Used it to great advantage during his time as Secretary of the Treasury. So these are a very few of the mail-related stories that we tell about Alexander Hamilton in this exhibit. And we also get into the whole issue of then later commemorations after his death, portraits of him on postage stamps, and what the sources of those portraits were, and how his reputation has in some way been shaped or influenced by his representations on stamps and currency over the years. After his death, Alexander Hamilton probably experienced the most fluctuation in his reputation or his legacy over the years. At the time he's killed in 1804, his political enemies or rivals are pretty much in control of the entire federal government. I mean, Jefferson is not only the President of the United States, he's at the height of his popularity, having just completed the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of the country for a very small amount of money. So he's extremely popular in 1804. The legislature, Congress, is almost completely in the hands of Hamilton's rivals. And because now the presidency and Congress have been dominated for almost 4 years by the Jeffersonians, they're now coming to dominate the judiciary as well. So my point is that at the time of his death in 1804, Hamilton is actually probably at one of the lowest ebbs of his influence in terms of government, and still having friends in high places. And that's reflected in the nature of his commemoration after his death. There's a huge funeral for him in New York when he dies, and he's certainly remembered among the societies to which he belonged, like the Society of the Cincinnati and others. But in terms of large-scale public monuments or commemorations, such as there had been for General Washington when he died just a few years earlier, or as there would be for other founders when they died in later years, there's very little in the way of public commemoration or memory of Hamilton, because his enemies are everywhere in power at the time of his death. He really doesn't undergo a renaissance of interest in him and his life and legacy until after the Civil War. And I think that's because Hamilton in many ways anticipated the sort of manufacturing future of the country that really didn't take hold until after the Civil War. And as the country moves steadily closer towards Hamilton's vision of a more or less urbanized manufacturing economy that he had predicted some 60 years earlier, there's a reawakening of interest in him. And that's why in the 1860s and 70s, we argue in this exhibition, we get the first currency and postage stamps featuring his picture, not until many years after stamps are already in use in the United States. And then there are long periods where there's very little interest in him, and it's kind of amazing. I mean, along comes this Broadway musical that puts Hamilton to the top of the charts. It's a little hard to remember that just 4 or 5 years ago, or whenever it was, right, he was very close to being kicked off the $10 bill. Nobody knew who he was and wanted him off the $10 bill. So this is a fellow who's unlike, Washington, Jefferson, many of the other founders, they certainly have controversies and have had scholarship about them, but interest in them and appreciation of them in one sense or another has been pretty steady over the years. Hamilton has really fluctuated quite a bit, and I think some of that possibly has to do with the fact that he died very young, that he was an extraordinarily polarizing figure, even in his own day, and that many key aspects of his vision for the future of America were not realized or didn't come to fruition until many, many years after he was dead. And so all of that has contributed. And you can trace that through his appearance in the currency and the postage stamps. When he pops up and when he disappears from the money and the stamps, I think are very telling about when people were thinking about him and celebrating him, or when they were not really thinking about him at all. So it's kind of telling. He's been on the $10 bill, I think, pretty continuously now since the late 1920s, early 1930s. He has not been on a postage stamp since 1957. It's the last time he appeared on a U.S. postage stamp. So So that's just a little bit of, I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense as to why the Postal Museum and a postal curator like myself is so interested in Alexander Hamilton, that his connections to letter writing and the post office department and all of that apparatus of sending and receiving mail in the late 18th and early 19th century, they were deep and useful connections to him, and we explore some of those in the exhibition. So with that, I'll take either questions about Hamilton or the exhibition, or if you just want to ask general questions about the museum or anything I haven't covered, I'd be happy to answer whatever questions you have. Yes?
Is there any mail between Washington and Hamilton?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Is there any here, or would I look for that?
No. Probably the single largest repository of Hamilton's letters, though, is up the block at the Library of Congress. Mount Vernon, I think, has some examples as well, but there are lots of letters between Hamilton.
There are a few, but I thought the
Washington.
ones we saw.
Well, the one that's on display right now at Mount Vernon is a regrets letter about Washington. The exhibit at Mount Vernon is a regrets letter from Hamilton to Martha after.
So that they're exhibiting a condolence letter after George Washington's death, a condolence letter from Hamilton. And Hamilton, after the death of Washington, by the death of Washington, Hamilton becomes the senior officer in the U.S. military. He's a major general at that point. So with Washington's death, Hamilton is now the highest ranking officer in the Army. And he succeeds Washington also as Secretary or President General of the Society of the Cincinnati. So Washington is the first President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, and Hamilton succeeds him as the second. And it's interesting, at the time of the duel in 1804, both Hamilton and Burr are members of the Society of Cincinnati, fairly prominent members of the New York chapter of the Society of the Cincinnati, and that actually for them internally was a huge blow for them internally, that members of the society, that one killed the other in a duel. So in some ways, after Washington's death, Hamilton inherits a number of his mantles, but then after Hamilton's death, his memory sort of fades while Washington's remains pretty constant. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about duels at this time. I mean, of public figures. I mean, we might not know about,
Right.
People in the backyard doing stuff. But I mean, was that very? Do you have any history about duels in the U.S.? I know in England they did them for a long time, or overseas.
Sure. So the question is about dueling and how commonplace dueling was. It was, I think, more commonplace than we would think among a certain social class. So dueling was something that you might get involved in if you were a gentleman, because a duel, another term for a duel, or the prelude leading up to a duel, was called an affair of honor. And so that presumes that you had some honor to defend as a gentleman. And so it was men of a certain social class, usually a fairly high social class, who occasionally engaged in dueling. It was often a ritualistic way to resolve disputes. I don't want to say that it wasn't the intention of a duel to kill anyone, but it wasn't necessarily the primary purpose. So a big part of dueling was simply showing the courage and fortitude to show up at the dueling grounds in the place of honor, to stand your ground and defend yourself against whatever accusation had been made, and restore your reputation. It was not uncommon for participants in a duel to do what was called throwing away the first shot. And there's been some argument that that's what Hamilton did in the 1804 duel. And then once all of the rituals had been satisfied, then there was an opportunity for the two parties to come to some accommodation or agreement about whatever had brought them to the dueling ground in the first place. But that's not to say that anyone thought that was a sure thing. So if you were involved in an affair of honor that progressed to a duel, it was pretty typical and pretty common, as Hamilton did before the duel, to write your will and get your affairs in order, because there was always a chance that something, something would go down, as they say, and that's what happened in this case. So many duels did not necessarily result in death, although many did, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion, and it was. It's very hard for us to wrap our head around. I mean, when you stop and think about the surreal nature of this particular duel, right? This is the former Secretary of the Treasury and a major general in the Army dueling with the Vice President of the United States. So the first thing we can take away from it is whatever we think about modern political climates and how bad they are, nobody's dueling yet, right? So we have this sort of conceit, I think, where we always like to think, as humans, we always like to think that whatever time we're living through is either the worst it's ever been or the best it's ever been, or the political climate in this period was really hostile, and it was not a nice climate right through the election of 1800 and 1804. But to put our heads sort of back, and it's very hard 200 plus years later, 215 years later, to kind of look at political disputes being resolved that way. But both men were there thinking that they were restoring their honor, especially Burr, and of course the legacy of the duel does anything but restore Burr's honor. The sitting Vice President of the United States is now indicted for murder and dueling in 2 states, New York and New Jersey, and becomes a fugitive and goes on trial. Eventually is brought back to New York and stands trial. He's acquitted on charges of both dueling and murder in both states. It's illegal in both states. Dueling is illegal in both New York and New Jersey, although New Jersey was either thought at the time to be a little more lenient about it, or it was easier to conceal what you were doing in the woods over in New Jersey than it was, at the foot of Manhattan Island in 1804. And then he's dropped from the Democratic Republican sort of scene. He goes out west into the Louisiana Purchase territories and becomes involved in a sort of a shadowy plot later on to try and he's accused of trying to establish a separate country out in the Louisiana Purchase territories. So his former boss, President Jefferson, actually brings him back and charges him with treason later on. He's tried and acquitted of treason, tries to revive his law practice, but ends up dying basically destitute and sort of ostracized in a New York boarding house in the 1830s. So it ends Hamilton's life, and it certainly doesn't restore Burr's reputation. How late does dueling go? There are reports of it in various places into the 1820s, 30s. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Who are some primary literary influences for Hamilton that he cites?
Well, so it's interesting. Literary influences for Alexander Hamilton. Well, we show a couple of them in the exhibition. And one is a set of books that was loaned to us by the Smithsonian Institution libraries, which is totally different sort of reading than any of Hamilton's counterparts in the American Revolution were really engaged in. So a number of Americans were captured by Hessian mercenaries in the American Revolution, and these Hessian mercenaries kept very detailed lists of all of their captured Americans' personal property, including the books that they were carrying. And so one of the things we can do is have a very good idea of what types of reading soldiers were doing in the field. 18th century warfare involved long periods of inactivity during which you could write and read letters. And if you were of a certain social class, you could socialize with people in the nearby towns and so forth. So we have a good idea of what soldiers were reading. Very few of them were reading 2-volume treatises on how to run a customs house and coinage and currency the way that Alexander Hamilton was. He lugged around with him during the Revolution an enormous 2-volume folio set by an author called Malachi Postlethwaite called the Universal Dictionary. And you can see it down in the exhibition, and it's on the website as well. And various places hold copies of this book, and it's been digitized. You can get PDFs of it online. And it is really the nitty-gritty of how to run a customs house and what types of forms you use in a customs service and how you fix excise rates on incoming and outgoing goods and so on and so forth. I mean, and we know that he was reading this carefully because in some of his pay and muster books that he was keeping as an officer in the Revolution, you know, on the back pages and random places, there are notes on his reading from Postlethwaite. So we know that he was reading these economic treatises, which is not what most soldiers were reading. Most soldiers were either reading popular novels or military manuals, because many of them had no or very little prior military experience.
And beforehand, when he was writing a letter about the hurricane, you know, going back to the earlier question, how, you know, in his formative years, what were his influences? Were they mostly novels and things just to expand vocabulary, or was he dead set from the beginning?
Well, I mean, a typical education in the 18th century would draw heavily on the classics, which is why so many of the founders were so well versed in the classics. Certainly religious literature. One thing that I think has not been emphasized about Hamilton over the years is that, I have no idea what that was. Didn't sound good though. Is that he, you know, he was fairly religious, composed some religious poetry and things of that nature, so he had clearly imbibed a lot of that at a young age. And much of his early education was due to the patronage of clergymen, and of course all the universities the universities that he applied to and the university that he attended in America were both run by the clergy. One was a Presbyterian school, that's the College of New Jersey, and the other was a Church of England school, Columbia University. So he would have had a deep reading of biblical and religious texts and classical as well. But then he also had this sort of side reading of, at a very young age. I'm talking about a 19-year-old captain in the Army reading books on coinage and and tariffs and running a customs house. It's not your standard fare. Sure. Sorry, was there another question in the back?
Yes. Question. He's saying there, he doesn't even have the job yet. He's already studying to get it.
Yes, yes. There's a certain intentionality about Hamilton's life and his career that's really remarkable, to me anyway. He is as close to what we would identify today as a self-made man as probably any of the founders. Yes, sir.
Yeah, as Secretary of Treasury, he left the job early. Did he resign? I thought he apparently because Washington had appointed someone else to take his place.
Washington didn't as Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah.
He's only Secretary of the Treasury in Washington's first cabinet. He steps down at the end of Washington's first term.
And why did he?
But Washington didn't push him out.
Okay. Why did he step?
I think there was growing opposition to him in the cabinet, coalescing around not so much around Washington, but around the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. He had a tendency, this is something we see over and over again in Hamilton's career, when he was feeling frustrated, he had a tendency to just sort of walk away. He does that to Washington in the Army, when he's frustrated with he wants Washington to give him a field command. He's tired of writing letters and things for the general. He knows that if he wants a political career, he has to have some battlefield glory, some stripes won on the battlefield, and he keeps pestering Washington to give him a command. And Washington keeps saying, no, you're more valuable at headquarters, and finally Hamilton resigns his commission and walks away. Finally, he ends up coming back and gets back in Washington's good graces. He does it again at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He is sent to Philadelphia by George Clinton, the governor of New York. Clinton is against the new Constitution. He knows that Hamilton is for the Constitution, so he sends a delegation of 3 from New York. Hamilton, and then 2 Hamilton the Federalist, and then 2 Anti-Federalists, to make sure that Hamilton is always outvoted, because it was one state, one vote. So he makes sure that Hamilton's always outvoted, and Hamilton gets frustrated, and again, he just leaves the convention for long stretches of time. And I think the same thing happens in 1794, when Washington is standing for re-election, and he's increasingly frustrated with the opposition from Congress and from the other members of the cabinet, and he steps down. And he wants to go back to his law practice and make money. His family is growing. Contrary to all the speculation in the press that he was, skimming money off the public treasury and had offshore bank accounts, none of which he ever did, but it was commonly and frequently alleged in the press. He needed to get back to being a lawyer and making money, actually, to support his family. Yes?
What happened to Hamilton's family after he died?
The question is about what happened to Hamilton's family after he died. Well, his wife, Eliza, actually survives him and outlives him by decades. I'm trying to remember. I don't think Alexander Hamilton, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think he ever came to Washington, D.C. When he was Secretary of the Treasury, and the capital was in New York and Philadelphia and then Washington. I don't think he ever visited Washington, D.C., but his wife, who survived him by many decades, later on came to live in Washington, D.C. to be near her daughter, who was here. So she lived on, I think it was on F Street, with her daughter, and became almost kind of a historical curiosity in her own right. People would come to visit her and pay their respects to the widow of Hamilton, the few people that remembered her and him. One of the people that comes to visit her, one of the few that she turns away, is a guy named James Monroe, President of the United States, and she refuses to see him. She refuses to see him because he, in an earlier life, had revealed Alexander Hamilton's extramarital affairs to the press and caused a number of great scandals, and she was one of the few people, the President of the United States, that she refused to let into her home and to receive him, that happens here in Washington. That's kind of an interesting story. But Hamilton had 7 children. One of his children is actually also killed in a duel several years before him, and using the same set of pistols that's on display downstairs, by the way. It was the same set of pistols that killed Hamilton's son. But other than that, he has numerous descendants. There are Hamilton descendants, still today. Yeah. Does that answer your question? What happened to the family afterwards?
Well, thank you so
Sure.
much, Dan.
Okay.
And I have 2 announcements to make. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So usually we do the lunchtime lecture 3rd Wednesday of each month, but next we have summer schedule. In July and August we will have lunchtime lecture. For the July, it's gonna be the last Wednesday, and the August is TBD. But we'll be making these announcements on our social media, and we'll update our online calendar. And for the July one, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the semi-postal stamp. Semi-postal stamp, for those who don't know, is sort of like a charity stamp. If you buy certain stamp, then the proceeds goes to specific charity. And the breast cancer semi-postal stamp was the very first one. It was issued in 98.
Sounds
Is
right.
that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds right.
So yeah, please come back, and it always starts at noon. And thank you again for coming to the lunchtime lecture. And if you haven't visited the exhibition already, it's right below us and to this direction in the stamp gallery. And if you have any question to Dan, he can stick around a couple more minutes to answer any questions. Thank you.